The dust-laden wind whipped across Luke Hawthorne's face as he stood on the platform of the Rico train station in Colorado, anxiously checking his pocket watch for the third time in 5 minutes. The year was 1878, and after 3 years of working his cattle ranch alone following his father's death, Luke had finally given in to the crushing loneliness that accompanied the vast open spaces of the West. "Trains run in late today," drawled the station master, a gray-haired man named Wilkins who had managed the Rico station for nearly 15 years. "Probably got held up by that rockslide near Durango." Luke nodded, brushing back his dark brown hair from his forehead. At 26, he was younger than most of the established ranchers in the area, but the past few years had etched fine lines around his eyes that made him look older than his years. "You think she'll still be on it?" Wilkins chuckled. "Son, where else would she go? You're her intended after all." Luke shifted uncomfortably, the folded letter in his breast pocket feeling suddenly heavier than it had before. The advertisement he'd placed in that Boston newspaper 6 months ago had seemed like a practical solution at the time. He needed a wife to help with the ranch, to bring warmth to the cold cabin he called home. What he hadn't anticipated was Lydia Sokolov responding, a woman from Russia who, according to her brother's letter accompanying hers, spoke not a word of English. The distant whistle of the train cut through his thoughts, sending a jolt of nervousness through his body. He straightened his best shirt, the only one without patches, and adjusted his hat. "There she comes," Wilkins said unnecessarily as the black iron locomotive came into view, belching smoke into the clear Colorado sky. Luke swallowed hard. What had he gotten himself into? How was he supposed to build a life with a woman he couldn't even speak to? The train hissed to a stop and passengers began to disembark. Luke scanned the faces of each woman who stepped onto the platform, looking for someone who matched the description he'd been given. Blonde hair, blue eyes, 22 years old. And then he saw her. She stood uncertainly on the platform, a small trunk at her feet and a battered valise clutched in her gloved hands. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a simple bun, wisps of it framing a face that struck Luke with its quiet beauty. She wore a plain blue traveling dress that had clearly seen better days, but she carried herself with a dignity that made the worn fabric seem inconsequential. Luke removed his hat and approached her slowly, as if she might startle like a wild deer. "Miss Sokolov?" he asked, knowing full well she wouldn't understand. Her blue eyes widened slightly as she looked up at him. "Lydia Sokolov," she said, pointing to herself. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded paper. Luke recognized his own advertisement, cut from the newspaper. "Yes," he said, nodding and pointing to himself. "Luke Hawthorne." "Luke," she repeated carefully, her accent heavy but her voice soft and musical. She attempted a small curtsy, nearly dropping her valise in the process. Luke caught it before it hit the ground and their hands brushed. He felt an unexpected jolt, like the static shock from wool socks on a cold winter day. Their eyes met, and for a moment, language didn't seem important at all. "Well," he said, clearing his throat and breaking the moment, "I suppose we should get you home. It's a bit of a ride." He gestured toward his wagon waiting nearby, making a driving motion with his hands. Lydia nodded, seemingly understanding his pantomime. She looked back at the train once, her expression unreadable, before allowing Luke to take her trunk. As they walked to the wagon, Luke felt the stares of the townspeople. Rico wasn't large, barely 500 souls, and news of his mail-order bride had spread faster than a prairie fire. He could already imagine the gossip. Poor Hawthorne boy got himself a foreigner who can't even talk to him. Luke helped Lydia onto the wagon bench, then secured her trunk in the back before climbing up beside her. She sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed straight ahead. "It's about an hour to the ranch," he said, knowing she wouldn't understand but feeling the need to fill the silence. "It's not much, but it's good land. My pa built the house himself when he came out here in '52. Lydia glanced at him, then offered a tentative smile that transformed her face. Luke found himself smiling back as he flicked the reins and set the horses in motion. The wagon rattled down Rico's main street, past the general store where Mrs. Patterson stood watching openly, past the saloon where several cowboys paused their midday drinking to stare, past the small church where Reverend Miller was sweeping the steps. "That there's Reverend Miller," Luke said, pointing. "He'll be marrying us on Sunday if that's still what you want." Lydia followed his gesture, nodding when she saw the church, though Luke doubted she understood his meaning. The realization that he was bringing home a bride he couldn't communicate with struck him anew. What had seemed like a practical solution now felt like madness. As they left the town behind, the road wound through pine forests and meadows bursting with summer wildflowers. Lydia's rigid posture gradually relaxed as she took in the landscape, her eyes widening at the sight of the Rocky Mountains rising majestically in the distance. "Beautiful," she said suddenly in heavily accented English, gesturing at the view. Luke looked at her in surprise. "Yes," he agreed. "Beautiful." She smiled again, and Luke felt something warm unfurl in his chest. Perhaps this wouldn't be such a disaster after all. The ranch came into view as they crested a hill, a modest cabin with a barn and corral nestled in a valley surrounded by pine trees, with a small creek running nearby. Cattle dotted the hills beyond, black specks against the green grass. "Home," Luke said, pointing. Lydia followed his gesture, taking in the modest homestead. If she was disappointed by its humble appearance, she didn't show it. Instead, she nodded and repeated, "Home." As Luke helped her down from the wagon, he found himself studying her face, trying to read what lay behind those clear blue eyes. What kind of courage must it take, he wondered, to travel halfway around the world to marry a stranger whose language you didn't speak? He carried her trunk into the cabin, watching as she took in the simple furnishings, the rough-hewn table and chairs, the cast-iron stove, the small bookshelf containing his father's Bible and a few dog-eared novels. A ladder led to the loft where Luke slept, and a curtained-off area in the corner contained a small bed that had once belonged to his mother. "You can sleep there," he said, pointing to the curtained area. "I'll stay in the loft until after the wedding." Lydia didn't respond, but walked slowly around the cabin, trailing her fingers along the back of a chair, examining the few pieces of crockery on the shelf by the stove. She paused at the window, looking out at the mountains, and Luke was struck by how right she seemed standing there, framed by the window of his home. Then she turned to him, her expression resolute, and spoke a stream of Russian words he couldn't understand. When she finished, she looked at him expectantly. Luke spread his hands helplessly. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." Lydia frowned, then pointed to herself, then to the stove, and mimicked stirring something. "You want to cook?" Luke guessed. She nodded vigorously. "Are you hungry?" "Do you want to make dinner?" Lydia moved to her valise and opened it, pulling out a small book. She flipped through it, then pointed to a word written in Cyrillic script, then to its English translation. "Work." Luke understood then. She wanted to earn her keep, to show him she would be useful. "Yes," he said, nodding. "You can cook if you'd like. I'm not much of a cook myself." That seemed to satisfy her. She turned to examine the stove more closely, then opened the nearby cabinet to inventory his meager supplies. Luke watched her for a moment before speaking again. "I'll go tend to the horses and bring in your trunk. Make yourself at home." She didn't respond, already busy examining a sack of flour, but Luke didn't mind. For the first time since his father's death, the cabin felt less empty. Outside, as he unhitched the horses, Luke found himself thinking that perhaps words weren't as necessary as he'd feared. Perhaps there were other ways to build understanding. He had no way of knowing then how true that thought would prove to be, or how the coming months would test both their resolve in ways neither could have imagined. When Luke returned to the cabin an hour later, having tended the horses and checked on the nearest herd, the scent of cooking filled the air. Lydia stood at the stove, her sleeves rolled up, her hair now tied back with a simple kerchief. She had managed to create some kind of stew from his modest provisions, and the small table was set with his 2 plates and cups. She looked up when he entered, offering a hesitant smile. "Eat," she said, another English word she apparently knew. "It smells wonderful," Luke said, removing his hat and hanging it on the peg by the door. He moved to the basin in the corner, washing his hands and face before sitting at the table. Lydia served the stew, a hearty mixture with the last of his potatoes, carrots, and salted beef, then sat across from him, watching nervously as he took his first bite. The flavors were unfamiliar. She had used spices he didn't recognize, probably from her own supplies, but delicious. "This is very good," he said, nodding appreciatively and patting his stomach. Her face brightened at his approval and she began to eat as well. They ate in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. When they finished, Luke started to rise to clear the dishes, but Lydia shook her head firmly. "I can help," he protested, but she was already gathering the plates. Luke sat back down, watching as she efficiently cleaned up. "We should have a wedding present for you," he said suddenly. "Something to make this place more like home." She glanced at him, clearly not understanding his words but picking up on his thoughtful tone. Luke looked around the cabin, seeing it through new eyes, the sparse furnishings, the utilitarian nature of everything. There wasn't a single item that existed purely for beauty's sake. His mother had had a collection of china figurines once, but they'd been sold years ago when money was tight. "Tomorrow," he decided. "We'll go to town tomorrow and get something nice for the house and some proper food supplies." Lydia had finished washing the dishes and was now unpacking her trunk, carefully arranging her few belongings in the small chest of drawers in her curtained area. Luke caught glimpses of neatly folded dresses, a hairbrush with a silver back, and what looked like a small icon with the image of a saint. She emerged with a small package wrapped in brown paper, which she presented to him with a formal little nod. "For me?" Luke asked, surprised. Lydia nodded again, gesturing for him to open it. Inside was a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue wool, incredibly soft to the touch. Luke ran his fingers over it, touched by the gift. "Thank you," he said, meeting her eyes. "It's beautiful." "Spasibo," she replied, which Luke guessed was thank you in Russian. "Spasibo," he repeated carefully, making her smile. They spent the evening in quiet companionship, Luke showing her around the cabin, using gestures to explain how the stove worked, where he kept the water bucket, how to bar the door at night. Lydia watched attentively, occasionally consulting her small translation book when she needed to understand a specific word. As darkness fell, Luke lit the oil lamp and noticed Lydia stifling a yawn. "You must be exhausted," he said. "It's been a long journey for you." She didn't understand his words, but his gesture toward the curtained bed seemed to convey his meaning. She nodded gratefully and gathered her nightclothes, disappearing behind the curtain. Luke sat at the table a while longer, listening to the small sounds of her preparing for bed, feeling both strange and comforted by the presence of another person in his home. Eventually, he climbed up to his loft, lying on his straw mattress and staring up at the roof beams in the dim light. What kind of marriage could they build without words? He wondered. And yet, there had already been moments of connection that transcended language. Her smile when he approved of her cooking, the care she had put into making him the scarf, the shared appreciation of the mountain view. Perhaps, Luke thought as he drifted toward sleep, they could learn to speak with more than just words. The next morning, Luke woke at dawn as usual, climbing quietly down from the loft to avoid waking Lydia. To his surprise, she was already up, dressed in a simple work dress with her hair neatly braided, stoking the fire in the stove. "Good morning," he said. She turned, offering a small smile. "Good morning," she replied carefully, the English words sounding rehearsed. Luke felt oddly pleased that she had learned this greeting overnight. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, before remembering she wouldn't understand. Lydia tilted her head questioningly. Luke mimed sleeping, then gave a thumbs up with a questioning look. She nodded, returning the thumbs up. Then she pointed to a pot of coffee already brewing on the stove. "Thank you," Luke said, genuinely grateful. It had been a long time since anyone had made coffee for him in the morning. After breakfast, Luke tried to explain that they would go into town. He pointed to the two of them, then toward Rico, and mimed driving the wagon again. Lydia seemed to understand, nodding and reaching for her shawl. The ride to town was less tense than the day before. Lydia sat more comfortably on the wagon bench, sometimes pointing to things. They passed a deer watching from the forest edge, a hawk circling overhead and saying the Russian word for them. "Deer," Luke would reply, giving her the English word. "Hawk." She would repeat after him, her accent heavy but her attempt sincere. By the time they reached Rico, they had exchanged a dozen words this way, and Luke found himself enjoying the simple language lesson. The town was busier than the day before, being a Saturday. Farmers from the surrounding area had come in to trade, and the main street was lined with wagons. As Luke helped Lydia down from their wagon, he noticed the curious stares directed their way. Luke Hawthorne, called a voice, and Luke turned to see Sheriff Thomas Morgan approaching. "Heard your bride arrived yesterday." "Yes, Sheriff," Luke replied, nodding politely. "This is Lydia Sokolov." Sheriff Morgan tipped his hat to Lydia. "Madam, welcome to Rico." Lydia, understanding she was being greeted, curtsied slightly. "Thank you," she said in her accented English. The sheriff raised his eyebrows, looking at Luke. "Heard she didn't speak English." "She's learning," Luke said, feeling strangely protective. "And we managed just fine otherwise." Morgan nodded, seeming satisfied. "Reverend Miller mentioned you're to be married tomorrow after service." "Congratulations." "Thank you, Sheriff," Luke replied. "If you'll excuse us, we need to visit the general store." As they walked away, Luke was aware of Lydia looking at him questioningly. "Sheriff," he explained, pointing back at Morgan. "Law," she nodded, seeming to understand. At Patterson's general store, they were met with more curious stares from Mrs. Patterson and the other customers. Luke ignored them, helping Lydia select flour, sugar, coffee, and other staples. When they reached the fabric section, Lydia's eyes lit up at a bolt of cheerful yellow calico. "Do you like that?" Luke asked, noticing her interest. She ran her fingers over the fabric longingly but shook her head and moved on to a plainer, cheaper cloth. "No," Luke said, pulling the yellow calico back out. "This one for curtains maybe, or a tablecloth." He mimed hanging curtains at a window. Lydia's eyes widened. "Too expensive," she managed to say, clearly another phrase she had memorized from her book. Luke shook his head firmly. "Not too expensive, a wedding present." He wasn't sure she understood his words, but his tone must have conveyed his determination. After a moment, Lydia smiled and nodded, accepting the gift. Luke had misses. Patterson cut 5 yards of the fabric, enough for curtains and a tablecloth, then added a set of blue ceramic dishes to their purchases on impulse. They were simple, but prettier than his old chipped plates. As Mrs. Patterson wrapped their purchases, she gave Luke a knowing look. "My Henry always said the way to a happy marriage is to make sure your wife has a pretty kitchen." Luke felt his face warm slightly. "She deserves something nice. It can't be easy coming to a strange country." Mrs. Patterson's expression softened. "No, I suppose not." She turned to Lydia and spoke very slowly and loudly, as if that would help overcome the language barrier. "You are very lucky to have Luke. He is a good man." Lydia looked confused by the strange delivery but smiled politely. As they left the store, Luke spotted Daniel Fletcher, his nearest neighbor, hitching his wagon across the street. "Wait here a moment," he told Lydia, miming for her to stay put. "I need to speak with someone." Fletcher was a gruff man in his 40s who had helped Luke out on several occasions after his father's death. He looked up as Luke approached. "Heard your mail-order bride came in," Fletcher said without preamble. "Russian, they're saying." "That's right," Luke confirmed. "I actually wanted to ask you a favor. Do you still have those 2 milk cows you were thinking of selling?" Fletcher nodded. "The Jersey and the Guernsey, good milkers, both of them." "I'd like to buy them," Luke said. "It would give Lydia something to do, make butter and cheese maybe. And I could use the extra income." Fletcher considered this. "I could let them go for $60 for the pair, but I thought you were running low on cash after that bad winter." Luke winced. It was true the harsh winter had taken a toll on his herd and money was tight. "What about a trade?" "I've got that new Winchester rifle my pa ordered before he died. Never even fired it. Must be worth at least that much." Fletcher's eyes lit up. He was an avid hunter. "That's a fair trade. I'll bring the cows by on Monday, give you newlyweds a day to yourselves after the ceremony." "Much obliged," Luke said, shaking the man's hand. When he returned to Lydia, she was watching a mother and young daughter across the street, a wistful expression on her face. The sight gave Luke pause. Had she left family behind in Russia, parents, siblings? He realized how little he knew about the woman who would be his wife tomorrow. On the ride home, Luke tried to explain about the cows' miming milking actions. Lydia's face brightened with understanding, and she nodded enthusiastically, saying something in Russian that sounded approving. Back at the ranch, Lydia immediately set to work measuring the windows for the new curtains. Luke left her to it, needing to check on the cattle and repair a section of fence that had been damaged in the last storm. When he returned hours later, dusty and tired, the transformation of the cabin took him by surprise. Lydia had hung bright yellow curtains at the windows, spread a matching cloth on the table, and arranged wildflowers in a mason jar as a centerpiece. The new blue dishes gleamed on the shelf by the stove, and the whole place smelled of baking bread. Lydia looked up from her sewing. She appeared to be hemming one of her dresses and smiled at his reaction. "It looks like a home," Luke said, genuinely moved by the simple touches that had so changed the feel of the place. She set aside her sewing and came to take his hat, gesturing for him to sit at the table. She served him fresh bread with butter she must have found in the springhouse, along with the last of yesterday's stew, reheated and somehow improved. As they ate, Luke found himself wishing he could ask her about her journey, about her life before coming to America. Instead, he tried another approach. He pointed to himself, then held up 26 fingers, then pointed to her with a questioning look. Lydia understood immediately. 22, she said, holding up the appropriate number of fingers. Luke nodded, then pointed to himself again and said, Colorado, then gestured around them before pointing to her questioningly. St. Petersburg, she replied, then added something in Russian he couldn't understand. Luke nodded as if he comprehended, not wanting to discourage her. Family. He asked, miming rocking a baby, then standing tall like a man, then like a woman. Lydia's expression grew sad. She shook her head, drew her finger across her throat, then pointed upward. They died, Luke guessed, feeling a pang of sympathy. She nodded, her eyes glistening. Brother, she added, making a gesture like writing. America. Then she made a motion like shoveling, followed by pointing to herself and miming writing a letter. Luke pieced it together. Her brother had come to America first, perhaps to work in the mines, and had arranged for her to come as well. But something had happened to him. Your brother died too, he asked gently. Lydia nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, looking embarrassed by the display of emotion. Luke reached across the table and squeezed her hand briefly. I understand, he said softly. My parents are gone too. They sat in silence for a moment, connected by their shared losses despite the language barrier. Later that evening, as Lydia prepared for bed, Luke sat at the table thinking about the wedding the next day. He had arranged everything with Reverend Miller, but now he wondered how Lydia felt about marrying a stranger in a ceremony she wouldn't understand. When she emerged from behind the curtain in her nightdress and robe, Luke gestured for her to sit at the table with him. He pulled out his father's old Bible and opened it to show her the family registry page where births, marriages, and deaths were recorded. He pointed to the entry for his parents' wedding, then to the church in town they had visited earlier, then made a gesture like placing a ring on his finger, and finally pointed to tomorrow on the small calendar hanging by the stove. Lydia studied his pantomime, then nodded slowly in understanding. Wedding, she said carefully. Yes, Luke confirmed, our wedding, tomorrow. He pointed to himself, then to her, then joined their hands together briefly. Yes, Lydia agreed, her cheeks coloring slightly. But then her expression grew uncertain, and she pointed to herself, then made a gesture like she was asking a question. Luke frowned, not understanding. She tried again, pointing to herself, then making a rocking motion with her arms like holding a baby, then gestured around the cabin, and finally pointed to him with a questioning look. Luke thought he understood then. She was asking if he expected her to be just a housekeeper and mother, or if he wanted something more. The question revealed a vulnerability he hadn't glimpsed before. He considered how to answer, wishing for the right words. Finally, he placed his hand over his heart, then reached across to gently touch her cheek. Yes, he said softly. I want that too. Lydia's eyes searched his, and whatever she saw there seemed to reassure her. She nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. They sat in companionable silence for a few more minutes before Lydia yawned and Luke gestured that she should go to sleep. As she disappeared behind the curtain, Luke remained at the table, thinking about the day ahead. Tomorrow, he would marry a woman he could barely communicate with. It was madness by any rational measure. And yet, in the day and a half since Lydia had arrived, his empty house had begun to feel like a home again. Perhaps there was wisdom in this madness after all. Sunday dawned clear and bright, a perfect late summer day in the Colorado mountains. Luke rose early, putting on his best suit, the one his father had been married in, carefully preserved all these years. It was slightly loose on his leaner frame, but Mrs. Patterson had helped him make the necessary adjustments the week before. By the time he descended from the loft, Lydia was already awake, but she remained behind her curtain. A breakfast of coffee and fresh bread waited on the table for him. "Thank you," he called out, hearing rustling sounds that suggested she was dressing. "Welcome," came her reply, another new English word added to her vocabulary. Luke ate quickly, then hitched the horses to the wagon. When he returned to the cabin, Lydia was standing by the window, and the sight of her made him stop in his tracks. She wore a dress of deep blue, simply cut but beautifully fitted to her slender form. Her blonde hair was arranged in an intricate braid around her head, with small white flowers tucked into it. Around her neck hung a delicate silver cross. "You look beautiful," Luke said, the words inadequate to express the vision before him. Lydia blushed, smoothing her hands down the skirt of her dress nervously. "Good?" she asked, gesturing to herself. "Very good," Luke assured her, then pointed to himself with a questioning look. She smiled and nodded. "Very handsome," she said carefully, clearly another phrase she had memorized for the occasion. Luke offered his arm and she took it, walking with him to the wagon. He had lined the bench with a blanket to protect her dress from the dust, a gesture she acknowledged with a grateful smile. The ride to town was quiet, both of them seemingly lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived at the church, Luke was surprised to see quite a crowd gathered. It seemed most of Rico had turned out for the event. Reverend Miller met them at the door, a kindly man in his 50s who had known Luke since he was a boy. "Are you ready, son?" he asked. Luke nodded, suddenly nervous. "She won't understand the ceremony," he said quietly. "The language of love transcends words," the Reverend assured him, "and I've prepared something special." He held up a small book, a Bible printed in Russian. "Found it among my late father's things. Thought it might help your bride feel more at home." Luke was touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Reverend." Inside the church, the pews were filled with familiar faces, neighbors, shopkeepers, ranchers, and their families. Luke recognized Daniel Fletcher, Sheriff Morgan, Mrs. Patterson and her husband, and dozens of others. Not all had been supportive of his decision to send for a bride, particularly one who didn't speak English, but they had come anyway, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of genuine goodwill. The ceremony itself was simple. Reverend Miller spoke the traditional words, occasionally showing passages from the Russian Bible to Lydia, who would nod in understanding. When it came time for the vows, the Reverend guided them through, having Luke repeat the promises first. "I, Luke Hawthorne, take thee, Lydia Sokolov, to be my wedded wife." His voice was steady as he made these solemn promises to the woman before him, whose eyes never left his face. When it was Lydia's turn, she surprised everyone by reciting her vows in carefully practiced, heavily accented English. She must have spent hours memorizing the words without understanding most of them. The effort touched Luke deeply. "I, Lydia Sokolov, take thee, Luke Hawthorne, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward." Her determination to speak his language, to meet him halfway in this commitment they were making, spoke volumes about her character. Luke found himself thinking that he was fortunate indeed to have such a woman as his wife. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Luke gently lifted Lydia's chin and placed a chaste kiss on her lips. It was their first kiss, brief and sweet, but it sent a current through him that he hadn't expected. The congregation applauded, and then they were being congratulated, women embracing Lydia, men shaking Luke's hand and slapping his back. Someone had organized a small reception in the church hall, with punch and cake provided by the Ladies' Aid Society. Throughout it all, Lydia stayed close to Luke's side, her hand often finding his arm as if to anchor herself in this sea of strangers. He found himself constantly aware of her presence, attuned to her reactions in a way that surprised him. It was late afternoon by the time they returned to the ranch, their home now, truly shared. Luke helped Lydia down from the wagon, but instead of releasing her hand, he held it a moment longer. "Wife," he said, pointing to her. "Wife," she repeated, nodding. Then she pointed to him. "Husband?" "Yes," Luke agreed, feeling the weight of the word. He had woken that morning a bachelor and would sleep tonight a married man. The transformation seemed both momentous and yet, looking at Lydia, somehow natural, as if things were now as they should be. Inside the cabin, they stood awkwardly for a moment. Luke was acutely aware that the curtained area was no longer Lydia's alone. They would share the bed tonight and every night thereafter. The thought sent a flush of heat through him. Lydia seemed to sense his thoughts, her cheeks coloring slightly. She moved to the stove, clearly intending to prepare their wedding supper, but Luke gently caught her arm. "No," he said, shaking his head. "Not tonight. Tonight I cook for you." She looked surprised but pleased by his declaration. Luke wasn't much of a cook, but he could manage a simple meal. While Lydia changed out of her wedding dress, he prepared venison steaks, potatoes, and the last of the summer greens from his small garden. They ate by the light of extra candles Luke had placed around the cabin, creating a warm, intimate atmosphere. He had even opened a bottle of wine he'd been saving for a special occasion. After dinner, as Lydia cleared the plates despite his protests, Luke took his father's old fiddle from its case on the shelf. He wasn't particularly skilled, but he knew a few tunes. Sitting by the fireplace, he began to play a simple waltz. Lydia looked up in surprise, her eyes lighting with pleasure at the music. Luke stood and held out his hand in invitation. When she took it, he led her to the center of the small cabin and showed her how to position her hands for the dance. Slowly, they began to waltz around the room, Luke humming the melody as he couldn't play and dance at the same time. Lydia was a quick learner, following his lead with increasing confidence. By the third circuit of the cabin, they were moving together smoothly. As if they had danced together many times before. When the imaginary music ended, they remained standing close together, Luke's hand at her waist, hers on his shoulder. In her eyes, Luke saw a mixture of shyness and invitation that made his heart race. Gently, he leaned down to kiss her, giving her plenty of time to turn away if she wished. But Lydia rose on her tiptoes to meet him, her lips soft and yielding against his. This kiss was different from the brief one they had shared in the church, deeper, more intimate, carrying the promise of all that was to come. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Luke rested his forehead against hers. No words were needed to express what they were feeling in that moment, the connection that had formed between them, despite the language barrier, the promise of a future together. Later, as they lay together in the darkness of the bedroom that was now theirs, Luke listened to Lydia's steady breathing beside him. She had been shy but willing in their lovemaking, and the experience had forged a new bond between them, one that transcended the need for common words. Luke found himself thinking that perhaps this marriage of convenience, entered into for practical reasons, might grow into something much deeper. Already he felt a tenderness toward Lydia that went beyond mere attraction or gratitude for her presence. With that comforting thought, he drifted into sleep beside his new wife, his hand finding hers beneath the covers. The weeks that followed established a rhythm to their shared life. Each morning, Lydia would rise early to prepare breakfast while Luke tended to the livestock. After they ate, she would milk the cows Fletcher had brought, then spend the morning churning butter or making cheese, skills she apparently brought from her homeland. Luke worked the ranch, grateful for the approaching autumn that would bring cooler temperatures. In the evenings, they would eat dinner together, and afterward, Luke would teach Lydia English words while she taught him a few Russian phrases in return. Their language lessons became a favorite part of the day for both of them. Luke would point to objects around the cabin: table, chair, stove, and Lydia would repeat the English word, then give him the Russian equivalent. They created a small dictionary of sorts, writing down these word pairs in a notebook. As Lydia's English vocabulary grew, so did her confidence. By the end of their first month together, she could form simple sentences: "I make dinner," "Cow give milk," "Luke work hard." But it was the language beyond words that developed most between them. The way Lydia could tell Luke's mood by the set of his shoulders when he returned from a day's work. The way he learned to read her emotions in the subtle changes of her expressions. They developed their own shorthand of gestures and looks, a private communication that needed no translation. In early October, as the aspens turned golden on the mountainsides, Lydia fell ill. Luke found her bent over outside the cabin one morning, retching into the bushes. "Lydia," he exclaimed, rushing to her side. "Are you sick?" She straightened, wiping her mouth, looking embarrassed. "No sick," she said, though her pale face belied her words. Luke frowned, placing a hand on her forehead to check for fever. Her skin felt cool. "What's wrong then?" Lydia hesitated, then placed her hand on her stomach and looked at him meaningfully. "Baby," she said softly. "I think, baby," Luke stared at her, processing her words. "A baby, you're with child," she nodded, watching his reaction carefully. A surge of emotions swept through Luke's: surprise, joy, fear, pride. "A baby," he repeated, a smile spreading across his face. He placed his hand gently over hers on her stomach. "Our baby." Lydia's anxious expression melted into relief at his positive reaction. "You happy?" "Very happy," Luke assured her, pulling her into a gentle embrace. "Very, very happy." The news of the coming child changed something between them, deepening their connection. Luke found himself watching Lydia more carefully, insisting she rest when she looked tired, taking on some of her chores despite her protests. "You must be careful," he told her, miming rocking a baby to remind her of what was at stake. Lydia would smile at his concern but continued her daily tasks, though she did allow Luke to carry the heavy water buckets and chop extra firewood as winter approached. The first snow fell in late October, dusting the mountains with white. Lydia stood at the window, watching the flakes drift down with childlike wonder. "Beautiful," she said, a word that had become part of her regular vocabulary. "Not as beautiful as you," Luke replied, coming to stand behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist, his hands resting lightly on the slight swell of her stomach. She leaned back against him, content in his embrace. In that moment, Luke realized with certainty that what had begun as a marriage of convenience had transformed into something much deeper. He had fallen in love with his wife. The realization wasn't shocking, it felt like acknowledging something that had been true for some time. But it filled him with a warm certainty that they would face whatever challenges came their way together. That night, as they lay in bed, Luke propped himself on one elbow and looked down at Lydia's face in the dim light of the banked fire. "I love you," he said clearly, wanting her to understand these important words. Lydia's eyes widened slightly. "Love," she repeated, seemingly recognizing the word but uncertain of its context. Luke nodded, placing his hand over his heart, then touching her cheek gently. "I love you, Lydia." Her face softened with understanding and tears welled in her eyes. "Я люблю тебя," she replied in Russian, then carefully in English. "I love you, Luke." No translation was needed for what followed: the tender kisses, the gentle caresses, the wordless communication of two hearts that had found their home in each other. As winter settled over the Colorado mountains, the Hawthorne cabin became a warm haven against the cold. Luke had spent extra time weatherproofing the structure, determined that Lydia and their coming child would be comfortable through the harsh mountain winter. Their days fell into a pleasant routine. Luke would handle the outdoor chores, breaking ice in the water troughs for the livestock, feeding the cattle extra hay to help them through the cold months. Lydia kept the home fires burning, quite literally, maintaining a constant warmth in the cabin with careful attention to the stove. Her belly grew steadily rounder as the weeks passed, a visible reminder of the new life they had created together. Luke found himself marveling at the changes in her body, placing his hand on her stomach in the evenings to feel the baby's movements. "Strong," Lydia would say, laughing as the child kicked against Luke's palm. "Like father." "Smart," Luke would counter, kissing her forehead. "Like mother." Lydia's English improved daily, helped by the dictionary and grammar book Luke had purchased on one of his trips to town. She could now carry on simple conversations, though complex ideas still required patience and often creative gesturing on both their parts. One snowy evening in December, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Lydia brought out a small piece of fabric she had been working on secretly. It was a tiny baby gown, exquisitely embroidered with delicate blue flowers around the collar. "For baby," she said, holding it up for Luke to see. "In Russia, mother makes first clothes." Luke ran his fingers over the fine stitching, touched by the tradition and the love evident in every careful stitch. "It's beautiful, Lydia. Our baby will be the best-dressed child in Rico." She beamed at his praise, then looked thoughtful. "In America, father chooses name." Luke considered this. "Usually both parents decide together. Do you have names in mind?" Lydia nodded hesitantly. "If boy, Ivan for my father." "Ivan Hawthorne." Luke tried the name out. "It's a good name, strong." "If girl?" Lydia asked. Luke thought of his mother, gone now for 5 years. "Maybe Sarah." "After my mother." Sarah, Lydia repeated carefully. Pretty name, Sarah Hawthorne. She placed a hand on her rounded belly. You hear, little one, you have name now. Luke watched his wife talking to their unborn child, her face glowing in the firelight, and felt a contentment he had never known before. Whatever hardships they might face in life in the West certainly promised its share they would weather them together. Christmas brought a heavy snowfall that isolated the ranch for several days. Luke had prepared for this, stocking extra supplies and ensuring the livestock had adequate shelter. Inside the warm cabin, he and Lydia celebrated the holiday with simple gifts: a new scarf Luke had secretly purchased for Lydia on his last trip to town, a carved wooden box Lydia had made for Luke's pipe tobacco. New Year arrived with bitter cold but clear skies. Luke stood outside at midnight, following an old Hawthorne tradition, and fired his rifle into the air to shoot out the old year. When he returned to the cabin, stomping snow from his boots, he found Lydia waiting with a cup of hot cider spiced with cinnamon, a Russian New Year custom, she explained in her improving English. For good fortune, she said, raising her own cup in toast, and healthy baby. Luke touched his cup to hers. To our future, he agreed. January brought a thaw, then another freeze, then a series of storms that kept Luke busy clearing paths to the barn and checking on the cattle in the sheltered valleys. He worried about Lydia, now in her 7th month and moving more slowly, but she remained cheerful and busy, knitting tiny socks and blankets for the baby. It was during one of these January storms that trouble arrived at the Hawthorne ranch. Luke had gone to check on a group of cattle in the north pasture, concerned they might be stranded in the deep snow. He had been gone several hours when Lydia heard a pounding at the cabin door. Cautiously, she opened it to find 3 men standing there, their faces reddened from the cold, their clothes dusted with snow. One, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, pushed his way in without waiting for an invitation. Well, well, he said, looking Lydia up and down with an unpleasant smile. Hawthorne's foreign bride heard about you in town. Lydia stepped back, one hand protectively over her belly. Husband not here, she said firmly, her limited English making her sound more confident than she felt. Please go. The other 2 men had entered as well, closing the door behind them. One moved to the stove, warming his hands. Just need to get out of the cold a spell, madam, he said with false politeness. Your husband wouldn't want us freezing to death. Especially since we're old friends of his pa, added the scarred man, removing his hat and tossing it onto the table. Name's Vince Holloway. These are my brothers Tom and Sam. Lydia didn't believe for a moment they were friends of Luke's father. The way they looked around the cabin, assessing its contents, set off warning bells in her mind, but she was alone, heavily pregnant, and these men were between her and the door. Little food, little warm, she conceded, moving toward the stove. Then you go. Vince laughed, the sound lacking any genuine humor. Well, boys, seems the foreign lady is giving us orders. He stepped closer to Lydia. Thing is, we heard Hawthorne's been doing well for himself. New cattle, new milk cows, and we've had a run of bad luck ourselves. Lydia understood enough to realize these men were here to rob them. She thought quickly, trying to remember where Luke kept his rifle. Usually it was by the door, but he had taken it with him today. No money here, she said, lifting her chin defiantly. Husband take to town. Now that's a shame, Vince said, exchanging looks with his brothers. Guess we'll just have to take something else instead. He began opening cabinets, pulling out their modest belongings and examining them for value. The brother called Tom had wandered to the curtained bedroom area and emerged holding Luke's mother's silver hairbrush, one of the few valuable items they possessed. This might fetch something, he commented. Put down, Lydia demanded, her fear turning to anger. That brush was precious to Luke, a memento of his mother. Tom laughed, tucking the brush into his coat. Got spirit, doesn't she? The third brother, Sam, had been unusually quiet. Now he spoke up, looking uncomfortable. Maybe we should just go, Vince. She's in a family way, doesn't seem right. Vince silenced him with a sharp look. Shut up, Sam. We need whatever we can get. He turned back to ransacking the cabin, pulling out Lydia's small store of jewelry, her cross necklace, a pair of earrings, the simple gold band Luke had placed on her finger. Lydia felt rage building within her. These men were stealing not just objects, but memories, pieces of the life she and Luke were building together. Without stopping to consider the danger, she lunged forward and snatched her wedding ring back from Vince's hand. The scarred man reacted with surprising speed, grabbing her wrist and twisting until she cried out in pain and dropped the ring. "That was stupid," he growled, his face inches from hers. Suddenly, the door burst open and Luke stood there, rifle raised, his face a mask of cold fury. "Let her go," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Now." Vince released Lydia's wrist, taking a step back with his hand slightly raised. "Easy now, Hawthorne, just seeking shelter from the storm. Your wife misunderstood." Luke's eyes took in the scattered belongings, Lydia's frightened face, the jewelry clutched in Tom's hand. "Put everything back," he ordered, the rifle unwavering. "Then get out." The brothers exchanged glances, clearly calculating whether they could overpower Luke before he could shoot. Something in his expression must have convinced them it wasn't worth the risk. Sure, Vince said with false agreeability. "Just a misunderstanding." Slowly, they replaced the items they had pocketed. Luke stepped aside, gesturing with the rifle toward the door. "Don't come back," he warned as they filed past him. "Next time, I won't be so hospitable." When the door closed behind the Holloways, Luke immediately moved to Lydia, setting down the rifle to take her hands in his. "Are you hurt, the baby?" "We okay," Lydia assured him, though she was trembling with the aftermath of fear and anger. "They not hurt, only steal." Luke pulled her into a gentle embrace, mindful of her pregnant belly between them. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here," he murmured into her hair. "I should never have left you alone." Lydia shook her head against his chest. "Not your fault, you not know bad men come." She pulled back to look at him. "You know them?" Luke's expression darkened. "The Holloways, they've been trouble around these parts for years. Cattle rustling, petty theft. Their ranch failed after their father died, but they blame everyone else for their problems." He moved to the window, peering out to ensure the brothers had truly departed. Satisfied they were gone, he turned back to Lydia. "I need to ride to town, tell Sheriff Morgan about this." Alarm flashed across Lydia's face. "No, not leave now, storm bad and they maybe still close." Luke hesitated, torn between the need to report the incident and his reluctance to leave Lydia alone again. "You're right," he decided. "It can wait until morning, but tonight I'll keep watch." True to his word, Luke sat up that night, rifle across his knees, while Lydia slept fitfully in their bed. The Holloways didn't return, and by morning the storm had cleared enough for Luke to make the journey to Rico. Sheriff Morgan listened gravely to Luke's account of the incident. "Those boys have been getting bolder," he said, shaking his head. "I'll ride out there, see if I can pick up their trail, though the snow probably covered it by now." "I'm worried about leaving Lydia alone," Luke admitted. "With the baby coming in a couple months." The sheriff considered this. "Might be worth hiring someone to help out, a ranch hand who could stay in the barn, keep an eye on things when you need to be away." It was a good suggestion, and Luke spent the next hour making inquiries around town. Fortune smiled on him when he encountered young Billy Sumner, a reliable 17-year-old whose family farm had been hit hard by the winter. Billy was eager for work, and by noon he was riding back to the ranch with Luke, a bedroll and few possessions in his saddlebag. Lydia was initially wary of the newcomer, but Billy's respectful manner and obvious admiration for Luke soon won her over. The youth moved into the small room attached to the barn that had once housed seasonal workers in Luke's father's day, and quickly proved his worth by taking on many of the daily chores, allowing Luke to stay closer to home. February brought milder weather and no further sign of the Holloway brothers. Luke remained vigilant, but gradually the tension from the incident faded. Lydia's pregnancy progressed normally, her belly now so round that she laughingly complained she couldn't see her feet. In late February, Luke made a final trip to town before the baby's arrival, purchasing supplies they might need and arranging for the midwife, Mrs. Caldwell, to come when Lydia's time came. He also sent a telegram to the post office in Denver, where Lydia occasionally received letters from friends in the Russian community there. It was important that she have female company during this time, even if only through written words. March arrived with the first hints of spring, patches of bare ground appearing through the melting snow, the return of birdsong in the mornings. Lydia grew increasingly restless, nesting like a mother bird, rearranging the small cabin and repeatedly washing the tiny baby clothes she had made. Luke watched her with a mixture of tenderness and anxiety. He had sent word to Mrs. Caldwell the previous week, knowing the time must be drawing near, but the midwife had been called to another birth in a remote homestead and had not yet returned. "Baby comes soon," Lydia told him one evening, wincing slightly as she settled into a chair by the fire. "I feel different." Luke knelt beside her, taking her hand. "Should I ride for the doctor in Durango?" The town was further than Rico but had a proper physician. Lydia shook her head. "No time, I think. Women have babies without doctor for many years." She smiled reassuringly, though Luke could see the nervousness behind her brave front. "My mother had 8 children. I know what to do." Luke wasn't convinced but knew better than to argue with his determined wife. Instead, he made sure everything was ready: clean linens, hot water kept warming on the stove, the cradle he had built positioned near their bed. That night, Lydia's pains began in earnest. Luke sent Billy riding hard for Mrs. Caldwell while he stayed with Lydia, helping her walk when she needed to, supporting her through the increasingly intense contractions. The hours passed with agonizing slowness. Luke felt helpless as Lydia struggled, her face contorted with pain she tried not to show. He wiped her brow with cool cloths, held her hand when she needed to grip something, and prayed more fervently than he had since his father's death. By dawn, there was still no sign of Billy returning with the midwife, and Lydia's condition was becoming urgent. "Baby coming now," she gasped between contractions. "Must push soon." Luke had never felt so terrified, but he forced himself to remain calm for Lydia's sake. "Tell me what to do," he said, helping her onto the bed. Between pained breaths, Lydia gave instructions, drawing on knowledge passed from mother to daughter in her homeland. Luke followed her directions, positioning himself to catch the baby, laying out clean cloths, supporting Lydia as she began to push. What followed was the most miraculous and terrifying experience of Luke's life. After what seemed like hours of Lydia's straining efforts, a tiny head appeared, then shoulders, and suddenly Luke was holding his child, a son, red-faced and squalling with healthy lungs. "A boy," he said, his voice breaking with emotion as he laid the infant on Lydia's chest. "We have a son, Lydia." Tears streamed down Lydia's exhausted face as she cradled the baby. "Ivan," she whispered, looking up at Luke for confirmation. Luke nodded, too overcome to speak. Ivan Luke Hawthorne had entered the world on a spring morning in 1879, delivered by his father's hands, welcomed by his mother's heart. Mrs. Caldwell arrived an hour later with Billy, full of apologies for her absence, but pleased to find both mother and child doing well. She helped with the afterbirth and showed Luke how to properly clean and swaddle the baby, praising Lydia's strength and Luke's unexpected skill as an emergency midwife. The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and joy. Lydia recovered quickly, her natural vitality reasserting itself despite the difficult birth. Baby Ivan proved to have his mother's fair coloring and his father's strong constitution, nursing vigorously and sleeping soundly between feedings. Luke found himself transformed by fatherhood, experiencing a fierce protectiveness he hadn't known he was capable of. He would sit for hours watching his son sleep, marveling at the tiny fingers and perfect features. Word of Ivan's birth spread through the community, and soon visitors began arriving with gifts and congratulations. Mrs. Patterson brought a beautiful quilt she had made. Daniel Fletcher's wife delivered a wooden rocking horse Fletcher had carved. Even Sheriff Morgan rode out with a small silver cup engraved with the baby's name and birth date, a tradition he maintained for all children born in his jurisdiction. Spring advanced, bringing new growth to the land and new rhythms to the Hawthorne household. Lydia adapted to motherhood with natural grace, incorporating Ivan into the daily routines of the ranch. She would carry him in a sling across her chest while gathering eggs or tending her small garden, singing Russian lullabies that made Luke's heart ache with their beauty. Luke and Billy managed the increasing demands of the ranch as calving season arrived, bringing new life to the herds as well. The mild winter had been kind to the cattle, and the spring calves were strong and numerous, promising a good year ahead. By May, with the meadows bursting with wildflowers and the ranch thriving, Luke began to believe they had put the troubles of the winter behind them. The Holloway brothers hadn't been seen in the area for months, and Sheriff Morgan thought they might have moved on to Wyoming or Montana. Life settled into a pleasant pattern of hard work and domestic happiness. Lydia's English continued to improve, especially as she read simple stories aloud to Ivan each night. Luke found himself picking up more Russian words as well, creating a unique family language that blended both cultures. One warm evening in June, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, Ivan sleeping peacefully in his cradle beside them, Lydia turned to Luke with a thoughtful expression. "When I first come to America," she said in her now fluent but still accented English, "I was very afraid. I did not know you, did not know if you would be kind man or cruel man, did not know if I would ever feel at home." Luke took her hand, waiting for her to continue. "Now I know," she went on, squeezing his fingers. "This is home because you are here, you and Ivan." She smiled, the expression lighting her face with a beauty that still took Luke's breath away. "I am not afraid anymore." Luke raised her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. "When you first stepped off that train," he confessed, "I thought I'd made a terrible mistake. How could we build a life together without even being able to talk to each other?" Lydia laughed softly. "We learned to speak with more than words." "We spoke with our hearts," Luke agreed, pulling her close against his side, "and I wouldn't change a thing." As if to punctuate this declaration, Ivan stirred in his cradle, making the small snuffling sounds that preceded waking. Lydia moved to pick him up, but Luke stopped her. "Let me," he said, lifting his son and cradling him against his chest. The baby blinked up at him, his blue eyes so like his mother's focusing on Luke's face. Then he smiled, a toothless, open-mouthed expression of pure trust and love that made Luke's heart constrict with emotion. In that moment, with his son in his arms and his wife beside him, the setting sun gilding their small home with golden light, Luke knew with absolute certainty that the family they had created together was the greatest blessing of his life. The language of love, it turned out, needed no translation at all. The years passed with the changing seasons, each bringing new challenges and joys to the Hawthorne ranch. Ivan grew from a babbling infant to a sturdy toddler with his mother's fair hair and his father's determined chin. He became the center of their world, his first steps and first words celebrated like the greatest of achievements. By the time Ivan was 3, in the summer of 1882, the ranch had prospered beyond Luke's modest hopes. The cattle herd had nearly doubled. The milk cows provided a steady income through Lydia's excellent cheese and butter that she sold in town, and they had added chickens, pigs, and a productive vegetable garden to their holdings. Billy Sumner had become a permanent fixture at the ranch, no longer a boy but a capable young man who managed the cattle with an intuitive understanding that impressed even the most experienced ranchers in the area. His presence allowed Luke to spend more time with his family while still expanding their operations. Lydia's English had become nearly fluent, though her accent remained, a musical lilt that Luke found endlessly charming. She had become well respected in Rico, teaching several of the local women her techniques for cheese making and sharing Russian recipes that had become favorites at community gatherings. On a warm July evening, as they sat on their expanded porch watching Ivan play with the ranch dog, Luke noticed Lydia seemed unusually quiet, her gaze distant as she absently twisted her wedding ring. "What's on your mind?" he asked, reaching over to take her hand. Lydia smiled, a secret knowing smile that immediately piqued Luke's curiosity. "I have news," she said, turning to face him fully. "We will need Ivan's cradle again by winter." It took Luke a moment to understand her meaning. When he did, his face broke into a wide grin. "You're with child again." She nodded, placing her free hand over her still flat stomach. "Mrs. Caldwell confirmed it yesterday when I was in town. She thinks February, maybe early March." Luke pulled her into a gentle embrace, his heart full to bursting. Another child, their family growing, their love bearing fruit once more. "Ivan will be a wonderful big brother," he said, watching their son throwing a stick for the dog to fetch. "Yes," Lydia agreed, leaning against Luke's shoulder, "though we should prepare him. He has been the center of attention for so long," Luke chuckled. "He's got your strong will, I'm sure he'll adjust." The months that followed were busy ones. The fall cattle drive to Denver was the largest the ranch had ever undertaken, bringing a substantial profit that Luke immediately invested in improvements to the ranch house. He added 2 proper bedrooms, a larger kitchen, and glass windows to replace the oiled paper that had served them in leaner times. Lydia's pregnancy progressed smoothly, her body remembering the path it had traveled before. Ivan, after initial confusion about the concept of a sibling, became fascinated with his mother's growing belly, often placing his small hands on it to feel the baby kick. "His brother?" he would ask hopefully, having decided he wanted a boy to play with. "Maybe brother, maybe sister," Lydia would answer patiently. "We will love baby same either way." As Lydia's time drew near, Luke arranged for Mrs. Patterson to stay with them for a week or two around the delivery. Having experienced the terror of delivering Ivan without help, he was determined to be better prepared this time. February arrived with unseasonably mild weather, as if nature itself was easing the way for the new Hawthorne. On a clear morning with sunshine streaming through the bedroom windows, Lydia gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Elena Hawthorne, Sarah for Luke's mother, Elena for Lydia's. Unlike her brother's dramatic entry to the world, Sarah arrived with remarkably little fuss, after only a few hours of labor and just 3 determined pushes from Lydia. She was smaller than Ivan had been, with a dusting of dark hair that promised to be more like Luke's than her mother's fair locks. Ivan approached his new sister with solemn curiosity, peering into the cradle where she slept. "Small," he pronounced critically. "When can she play horses?" Luke laughed, ruffling his son's hair. "Not for a while, partner, but you can help Mama and me take care of her." "That's an important job for a big brother." Ivan considered this, then nodded with all the seriousness a 4-year-old could muster. "I help," he decided, and from that moment on he appointed himself Sarah's protector and guide, a role he took very seriously. The spring and summer of 1883 passed in a pleasant blur of family life and ranch work. Sarah proved to be an easy baby, content to watch the world from her cradle or from the sling Lydia carried her in. Ivan gradually adjusted to sharing his parents' attention, especially once he discovered how much his little sister seemed to adore him, breaking into delighted smiles whenever he approached. In August, as they celebrated Luke and Lydia's 5th wedding anniversary with a small party at the ranch, Sheriff Morgan brought unexpected news. The Holloway brothers had been caught robbing a bank in Pueblo. In the ensuing shootout, Vince and Tom had been killed, while Sam had been wounded and captured. "Thought you'd want to know," Morgan told Luke as they stood apart from the festivities. "Sam Holloway's been sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison. He won't be bothering your family again." Luke felt a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying lift from his shoulders. The Holloways had been a shadow at the back of his mind for years, a potential threat to the life he and Lydia had built. Now that threat was gone. That night, after the guests had departed and the children were asleep, Luke told Lydia about the Holloways. She listened quietly, then surprised him with her response. "I pray for them," she said simply. "Not the bad men who came to our home, but the boys they once were. Something make them choose wrong path." Luke marveled at his wife's capacity for compassion, so much greater than his own. It was one of the many qualities that had made him fall in love with her and fall more deeply in love with each passing year. "You're a remarkable woman, Lydia Hawthorne," he said, pulling her close. "I thank God every day that you answered my advertisement." Lydia laughed softly. "It was my brother's idea, you know. Before he died, he said American husband would be better than Russian poverty. He find your advertisement, help me write letter. Remind me to thank him when we meet in heaven," Luke said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "He gave me the greatest gift of my life." The years continued to pass, marked by the growth of their children and the prosperity of their ranch. Ivan grew into a sturdy boy with his father's love of the land and his mother's quick mind. Sarah developed into a thoughtful child with a talent for drawing and a gentle way with animals that made her a natural with the horses and cattle. By 1888, the Hawthorne Ranch had become one of the most successful operations in the county. Luke had added sheep to their holdings, a controversial decision among the cattle ranchers, but one that proved profitable when wool prices rose. Lydia had expanded her dairy production into a small business, with 2 local women helping to make the cheeses that were now shipped as far as Denver and Pueblo. They added a 3rd child to their family in 1885, Michael Daniel Hawthorne, named for Luke's father and their good neighbor Daniel Fletcher. Mike, as he was called from his earliest days, was different from his siblings from the start, louder, more demanding, more adventurous. By the time he was 3, he had fallen out of the hayloft, been rescued from the creek twice, and somehow managed to ride one of the calves until it bucked him off, resulting in a broken arm that he wore as a badge of honor. "He is going to turn my hair gray before it's time," Lydia would lament, though her eyes shone with love and amusement at her youngest child's antics. Luke would just shake his head and smile. "He reminds me of my brother James," he would say, always looking for the next adventure. Their family felt complete with the 3 children, each so different yet unmistakably Hawthorne in their own ways. Ivan, serious and responsible; Sarah, creative and compassionate; Mike, fearless and funny. They filled the ranch house with noise and life and occasional chaos that Luke and Lydia wouldn't have traded for all the peace and quiet in the world. The children grew up bilingual, speaking both English and Russian with ease. Lydia insisted on teaching them her native language and sharing the traditions and stories of her homeland. At Christmas, they would celebrate both the American holiday and the Russian Orthodox Christmas 12 days later. The children would receive gifts on both occasions, a source of envy among their friends in town. Education was important to both Luke and Lydia. When Ivan reached school age, they debated whether to send him to the small schoolhouse in Rico or to arrange for a tutor at the ranch. Eventually, they decided that the social experience of school was valuable, and so each morning Luke or Billy would drive the children to town in the wagon, picking them up again in the afternoon. The arrangement worked well, especially after Luke purchased a larger, covered wagon that could protect the children from the elements during the journey. Ivan thrived in the structured environment of school, often bringing home books to read in the evenings. Sarah, 2 years behind him, was equally enthusiastic about learning, particularly enjoying the art lessons the school teacher included in the curriculum. Life wasn't without its challenges. A harsh winter in 1889 decimated the sheep herd, forcing Luke to rebuild that part of the operation almost from scratch. A summer drought in 1891 reduced the hay harvest, leading to a lean winter for the cattle. And there were the normal trials of raising 3 spirited children: illnesses, accidents, and the occasional conflicts that arose between siblings. But through it all, the foundation remained solid: the partnership between Luke and Lydia that had begun with hardly a word in common between them. They had learned to communicate in ways that went far beyond language, building a connection that strengthened with each passing year. In the autumn of 1898, as they celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary, Luke took Lydia on a special trip to Denver, leaving the ranch in the capable hands of Ivan, now 19, and Billy Sumner. It was the first time they had traveled beyond Rico together since their wedding day, and Luke had planned it as a surprise for months. In Denver, they stayed in a fine hotel, ate at restaurants where Lydia's Russian accent drew curious but admiring glances, and attended a performance at the Opera House that left her with tears of joy in her eyes. Luke had secretly arranged for a photographer to capture their image in formal portrait, a gift to commemorate their years together. On their final evening in the city, as they walked arm in arm through a small park near their hotel, Luke stopped beneath a towering cottonwood tree whose leaves had turned golden with the season. 20 years ago, he said, turning to face Lydia, I was standing on a train platform in Rico, wondering what kind of madman sends for a bride who can't even speak his language. Lydia smiled, the lines at the corners of her eyes crinkling with the expression. At 42, her blonde hair was beginning to show threads of silver, but to Luke, she was more beautiful than ever. And I was on that train, she replied, wondering what kind of desperate woman travels across the world to marry a stranger. Luke took both her hands in his. I think we got our answer, didn't we? Lydia nodded, her eyes shining with emotion. Not madman, not desperate woman, just 2 people who find each other across ocean, across language, across everything that should have kept us apart. Luke agreed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. I have something for you. Inside was a gold ring set with 3 small diamonds. One for each of our children, Luke explained as he slipped it onto her finger above her simple wedding band. And because the proper anniversary gift for 20 years is China, there's a full set of dishes being delivered to the ranch next week. Lydia laughed through the tears that had welled in her eyes. Always practical, my Luke. She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the lines that years of sun and wind had etched around his eyes. I have gift for you too, but not here, at home. Then let's go home, Luke said, drawing her close for a kiss that held all the tenderness of 20 years of love. When they returned to the ranch, they found everything in perfect order: the cattle tended, the chores completed, even a special welcome dinner prepared by Sarah, now 16 and becoming an accomplished cook under her mother's tutelage. After the meal, as the family sat around the fireplace sharing stories of the parents' absence and their adventures in Denver, Lydia slipped away briefly. She returned carrying a large, flat package wrapped in brown paper. My anniversary gift, she said, presenting it to Luke with a mixture of pride and nervousness. Luke unwrapped it carefully to reveal a quilt, but not like any he had ever seen. Each square contained an image, some embroidered, some appliqued, some painted onto the fabric representing a milestone in their life together. There was the train that had brought Lydia to Rico, the small cabin as it had looked when they first married, a fiddle representing their first dance, baby Ivan in his cradle, the expanded ranch house, Sarah with her drawing pad, Mike on his first pony, and dozens more moments from their shared history. Lydia, Luke breathed, overwhelmed by the love and labor represented in the quilt. It's magnificent. How long have you been working on this? 2 years, she admitted, smiling at his reaction. Many nights after you sleep, it tells our story. The children gathered around to examine the quilt, exclaiming over the scenes from their childhood and the events from before they were born. Here's when I fell in the creek and Papa had to fish me out, Mike pointed out, laughing at the depiction of a small boy being hauled from blue fabric water. And here's my first blue ribbon at the county fair, Sarah added, finding the square that showed her standing proudly beside one of her drawings. The Holloway brothers, Ivan said more soberly, indicating a square that depicted 3 dark figures outside the cabin door. Lydia nodded. All part of our story, good and bad, happy and sad, all make us who we are. Luke looked up from the quilt to his wife's face, seeing in her eyes the same love and wonder he felt in his own heart. It's perfect, he said simply, just like the life we've built together. That night, as they lay in their bed beneath the story quilt, Luke reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a mail-order bride who spoke no English and a lonely rancher who spoke with his heart, they had created a family, a home, and a love that had only deepened with time. "What are you thinking?" Lydia asked softly, curling against his side in the familiar way she had done for 2 decades. "I'm thinking," Luke replied, drawing her closer, "that sometimes the greatest adventures begin when you can't understand a single word the other person is saying." Lydia laughed, the sound as dear to him as it had been the first time he heard it. "And sometimes," she added, "the heart speaks louder than any words." Luke couldn't have said it better himself. In the years that followed, the Hawthorne Ranch continued to thrive under the guidance of Luke and Lydia, and increasingly their children. Ivan, with his steady nature and head for business, took over more of the cattle operations. Sarah's artistic talents found a practical outlet in breeding and training horses, developing a line of cow ponies that became sought after throughout Colorado. And Mike, for all his wild youth, revealed a gift for innovation, introducing new farming techniques that increased their hay production and experimenting with crop rotation that improved their soil. As the new century dawned in 1900, bringing with it railroads, telephones, and the first automobiles, the Hawthorne family adapted while holding fast to the values that had sustained them through the changing times. Luke and Lydia watched with pride as their children came into their own, creating lives that honored their heritage while looking toward the future. In 1903, at the age of 24, Ivan married Rebecca Collins, the schoolteacher who had come to Rico from Boston 3 years earlier. Their wedding, held at the ranch under a canopy of aspens in full autumn glory, brought together the entire community to celebrate. As Luke watched his eldest son exchange vows with the woman he loved, he couldn't help but remember his own wedding day, so different yet similar in the most important ways. He glanced at Lydia, seated beside him in the place of honor, and found her already looking at him, the same memory reflected in her eyes. She reached over to squeeze his hand, and no words were needed between them. The ranch house, expanded several times over the years, now accommodated the growing family. Ivan and Rebecca built a small cabin nearby, close enough for daily interaction but offering the privacy a young couple needed. Sarah, at 21, had opened a small art studio in Rico, where she taught drawing to children, and sold her paintings of the Colorado landscape to tourists and collectors alike. Mike, at 18, divided his time between the ranch and the agricultural college in Fort Collins, where he was studying the latest scientific farming methods. As Luke entered his 50s, he began to step back from the most physically demanding aspects of ranch work, focusing instead on the business side of their operations. Lydia, whose cheese business had grown to supply hotels and restaurants in 3 states, trained a team of women to handle the production while she managed the accounts and developed new varieties. They were comfortable now, secure in a way Luke could hardly have imagined when he first inherited his father's struggling ranch. But material success was the least of their achievements. The true wealth of their lives lay in the family they had created, the community they had helped to build, and the love that had grown from such unlikely beginnings. In the spring of 1908, as they celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary, Luke and Lydia sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The scene was reminiscent of countless evenings they had shared over the decades, but this one held special significance. Earlier that day, Ivan and Rebecca had announced they were expecting their 3rd child, adding to their daughter Mary and son Thomas. Sarah had returned from Denver with news that her paintings would be featured in a proper art exhibition. And Mike had written from Fort Collins that he would be bringing a young lady home to meet the family, a fellow student named Elizabeth, whom he described as the most intelligent and beautiful woman I've ever met. 30 years, Luke mused, his hand finding Lydia's as it had thousands of times before. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that you stepped off that train. Lydia smiled, the expression lighting her face in a way that still made his heart skip. The years had silvered her once blonde hair and added lines of experience to her face, but to Luke, she was as beautiful as the day they met. Sometimes it feels like forever, she replied, her accent still present but softened by decades of American life. In the best way. Like I cannot remember time before you, Luke nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Do you ever wonder what might have happened if you hadn't answered my advertisement, if you had stayed in Russia? Lydia considered this for a moment. I would not have had this life, she said simply. Not our children, not this home, not you. She looked out over the ranch, the fertile fields, the healthy cattle, the orchard they had planted when Ivan was born, now bearing abundant fruit. God had planned for us, I think. Even when we not know the words to speak, he guide our hearts. Luke raised her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. The best decision I ever made was sending for a bride I couldn't talk to. Lydia laughed, the sound as musical as it had been 3 decades ago. And best decision I make is coming to marry man I never meet. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a familiar gesture of affection. We learn to speak with our hearts, yes. Yes, Luke agreed, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. And that's a language that never needs translation. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, they sat in comfortable silence. 2 people who had found in each other everything they hadn't known. They were seeking a partnership built on respect and understanding, a passion that had only deepened with time, and a love that had transcended every barrier. The mail-order bride who had arrived speaking no English, and the cowboy who had learned to speak with his heart, had written their own unique love story, one that would live on in their children, their grandchildren, and generations of Hawthornes yet to come. And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Luke and Lydia Hawthorne held hands on their porch, still finding in each other the home they had created together, word by precious word, heart to loving heart.